Conservative Senator David Wells. He sponsored Bill C-234 in the Senate, and he's here with us now. Senator, thanks for coming in. It's good to see you.
Hi, David.
Okay, so this was amended. So the original plan was a carbon tax exemption for barn heating and grain drying. It was amended to include grain drying, exclude barn heating. Is a partial carve-out a partial victory for you?
You know, I don't see it as a partial victory, even though it may be that grain drying may be exempt if this bill passes as it is now amended. That doesn't help those farmers and ranchers that need to keep their cattle or their livestock warm in the winter or cool in the summer. It doesn't help poultry farmers who have barns upon barns of thousands and thousands of chickens that need to have very specific temperature ranges to survive. So while it might help some, it doesn't help many of our food producers.
The vote was 40 to 39, so it was amended by a single vote. There are 94 senators. Where were the other 15?
So some were traveling, some were not, sick, or I don't know. I just know that I was there, and many of my colleagues were there on both sides, obviously.
So where do you think this goes now? Because the amendment was approved by the Senate. Do you have more work to do, or does it automatically go back to the House where they will deal with it? Because we're kind of running out of time in this parliamentary session. Where do you think this lands?
So it's a good question. I think if this amendment was defeated, they would have another one ready to. Those opposed to the bill would have another amendment ready to go. That's what I heard. That's what I was told by some colleagues. So I think that's what had happened. Now that an amendment has been added to the bill, for those whose purpose was to gut the bill or kneecap the bill, that's been done. So there may not be a need for another amendment. These are process amendments. These are amendments that have already been debated and defeated either at the House Committee or the Senate Agriculture Committee. So these are process amendments designed to kill the bill.
All right, so the Senator Dauphin, who put forward this amendment, says the debate in the Senate was surrounded by falsities and threats, and we certainly saw that with Senator Clement and Petitclerc, who say they were attacked after Andrew Scheer put some things on Twitter with their office numbers. What's your response to that characterization of how things have been handled in the Senate?
You know, I'm not going to comment on threats and things like that. It's been contentious. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. A lot of Canadians support the farmers, the ranchers, and the growers, and those who dry grain, and it's been emotional because these are motherhood issues. The cost of food. It's not just on everyone's discussion about the cost of everything, just about everything, but specifically food. Food is not a luxury. Food is a necessity, and one of our largest industries is the one that's hit hardest by this tax.
You know, you said, I believe earlier, that if this bill goes back to the House of Commons, it would effectively kill the bill, or words to that effect. I mean, where do you think this is now? Do you think this is done?
So that's a good question, and it bears some discussion. But now that the bill has been amended, the Prime Minister is on record saying there'll be no more carve-outs, so we know their position. We likely know the position of those who keep the government in power. So this bill, I think, can be killed by process in the House. It goes onto a list of other private members' bills that have been amended, and I think that's where it'll stay.
But the New Democrats, correct me if I'm wrong, but they voted for this the first time round in the House of Commons in its unamended form to send it to the Senate. I mean, we had this remarkable situation that tax changes were going to be imposed upon the government by the opposition and the Senate. I mean, surely you don't think their position has necessarily changed, do you?
So two things about that. When it was first in the House, it was passed by the Greens, the Bloc, the New Democrats, and all the Conservatives, and a few brave Liberals who saw that this was a good thing for our farmers, our ranchers, our growers, and our grain dryers. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see. If the NDP continues to support this as they did before, then it may yet be further amended in the House to come back to the Senate. As a political realist, I don't see that happening. The other thing, which I think is an important consideration, is that carve-outs or exemptions are built into the carbon tax system. On the CRA webpage, they have a page dedicated to fuel tax relief. which is an exemption.
Right.
And there are a number of industries that have an exemption from the carbon tax.
Well, including the agriculture sector, which has pretty broad exemptions, but just not on these particular areas, because as I understand it, it's seen as an incentive to look for alternatives, and there are other government programs to help farmers who may use fuels for these specific purposes to transition, right?
David, that would hold water if the transition fuels of natural gas and propane were exempted, but in fact, diesel and gasoline have the exemption.
Is that because of remote reasons?
For any farmer, right. For a farmer next to Calgary, diesel and gasoline have an exemption, whereas the transition fuels, the cleaner fuels, are not. So, on the face of it, it doesn't make sense to me.
So look, we've known each other for a long time, going back to our time in Newfoundland and Labrador together, and you've been a federal conservative the whole time I've known you. You heard what Kate was saying, your party was saying about senators and the unelected branch of government getting in the way of this sort of thing. I mean, how do you feel when you hear that criticism? You were appointed by Prime Minister Harper, right? So, like, how do you feel when you hear that?
You know what? It's something we've heard since, obviously, before I was appointed. This is our Westminster system.
Yeah.
You've got to have some people in the room that don't necessarily have to think about constituents or other issues that members of the House of Commons have to think about.
Right.
And that's the design of it. So it seems to have worked well in Canada for almost 160 years. It's the system that we have, and it's the system that I'm part of.
Okay, so with the system we have and the system what you're a part of, just as a final point, you really think this is it for 234? That this is done and dusted and maybe dead and buried after this result today?
I think that was the design of the latest machinations. And we know the Prime Minister was making phone calls on the weekend to some senators who might have been on the fence, some senators who actually voted down amendments all of a sudden saw the light in the government's favor. So that was curious as well. We hear that senators are independent, and you know what? Many of them are. But when you have Minister Guilbeault, Minister Wilkinson, the Prime Minister making calls to coerce and to cajole for a certain outcome, maybe the question of independence is a facade.
Well, but I mean, all the parties can do that, right? I'm sure Pierre Poilievre and others have called Senator Husakos I know what you mean, that they are Liberal appointed, though they don't sit in the Liberal caucus, and I understand the underlying argument. But is there something wrong with the government calling the upper house and trying to say, hey, we need our agenda to stay intact?
So there's nothing wrong with it unless you say you're not going to do it.
Oh, okay. All right. Senator David Wells, Conservative Senator David Wells, thanks so much for coming in. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.